More on the refugee crisis and the response from European nations. We're joined now by Timothy Snyder. He's a history professor at Yale University. He's also an editor of the book, The Wall Around the West, which looks at the issue of state borders and immigration controls. And Timothy, thanks so much for joining us and offering us your expertise on this issue. Let's not even talk about the present situation or the future, but let's talk a little bit about the past. This international treaty on refugees that was created after World War II, the 1951 Refugee Convention adopted by 142 countries. What does it do? What does it spell out?
It spells out the difference between a refugee and other kinds of migrants. It defines a refugee as someone who has a legitimate fear of political or other kind of repression if he or she returns to his country. This was very important for Europe and the world after the Second World War. Because of all of the destruction of states and all the movements of peoples, there are millions of people whose future was unclear. There were East Europeans who didn't want to go back to the Soviet Union. There were Jews who feared anti-Semitism. The definition of a refugee created a tool by which those people could be defined and by which they could be given certain rights.
So what are some of the rights that they get under this treaty?
If you are regarded as a refugee, this means that you have access to the legal system of the country where you've arrived. It means that you cannot simply be deported for having crossed the border illegally. It means that you get some kind of access and some kind of a chance to prove that you might be politically persecuted should you return.
Now, why do you think Germany is such a draw for these refugees?
Well, the German response, I think, is conditioned by the fact that the Germans, more than anyone else in Europe, have thought a good deal about the 1930s and the 1940s. They are aware at some level that the Second World War and indeed the Holocaust began with refugee crises, which were instigated in large measure by Germany itself. That history is very much alive to them. That matters for the Germans. From the point of view of the refugees, what matters is that the German Prime Minister has announced that Germany is actually capable of absorbing refugees. Germany also has an economy which needs workers. So those things are clear from the point of view of the refugees.
What kind of a strain does this put on these host nations? I mean, I'm hearing from one source today that perhaps Germany's going to have to take some of the money that they have funneled for next year and move it to this year because of this influx of refugees coming into the country. I mean, how tough is it for some of these countries to respond from a financial standpoint?
The most interesting thing to me is that there's really not much of a relationship between the projected financial strain and the current political strain. The countries that are complaining the loudest now aren't necessarily the ones that are facing any kind of financial pressure. A country like Poland, for example, or Denmark is not facing any financial pressure now, but nevertheless their governments are complaining a great deal about problems that they're not even facing. I would stress that a refugee crisis is a moment of political decision. How it works out economically over the long run is really not clear. But we certainly know in North America that in the long run, refugees or their descendants can be essential for an economy.
So I mentioned in the introduction that you were involved with this book, The Wall Around the West, State Borders and Immigration Controls in North America and Europe. So obviously, you know a great deal about this subject matter. So I'm wondering, as you watch this crisis, you undoubtedly look at it differently than the rest of us. What are you seeing where you can point to it and say, well, that's not a surprise? And what are some of the things that are surprising you?
Well, what's not a surprise is the challenge to the European Union. So that the European Union is based on the idea that there's an external border, and outside that external border there are different rules, and inside that external border there are European rules. And those European rules are generally very nice things. The price of having such a nice European Union has been an external border. The crisis that we're facing now is the question of what happens when very large numbers of people penetrate into Europe. And that raises the question of the core European value, which is solidarity. Unlike America, unlike Russia, unlike China, many Europeans actually pride themselves on solidarity. But what about when the solidarity has to be expressed to people who come from the outside? What has been surprising to me, in the good sense, has been the way that civil society has been out front of governments in many countries, including Austria and indeed in Germany, even in Hungary. Organizations that already existed or people spontaneously organizing to help refugees, to explain to refugees their rights. That has gone better, I think, than many people would have expected from a Europe where the main story, it seems, is very often national populism.
Timothy Snyder joining us live from New Haven, Connecticut. Can't thank you enough.